Ivanhoe, by Sir Walter Scott. Chapter 29. Ascend the watch-tower yonder, valiant soldier. Look on the field, and say how goes the battle. Schiller's Maid of Orleans. A moment of peril is often also a moment of open-hearted kindness and affection. We are thrown off our guard by the general agitation of our feelings, and betray the intensity of those which, at more tranquil periods, our prudence at least conceals, if it cannot altogether suppress them. In finding herself once more by the side of Ivanhoe, Rebecca was astonished at the keen sensation of pleasure which she experienced, even at a time when all around them both was danger, if not despair. As she felt his pulse and inquired after his health, there was a softness in her touch and in her accents, implying a kinder interest than she would herself have been pleased to have voluntarily expressed. Her voice faltered and her hand trembled, and it was only the cold question of Ivanhoe, "Is it you, gentle maiden?" which recalled her to herself, and reminded her the sensations which she felt were not and could not be mutual. A sigh escaped, but it was scarce audible, and the questions which she asked the knight concerning his state of health were put in the tone of calm friendship. Ivanhoe answered her hastily that he was, in point of health, as well and better than he could have expected. "Thanks," he said, "dear Rebecca, to thy helpful skill." "He calls me dear Rebecca," said the maiden to herself, "but it is in the cold and careless tone which ill suits the word. His war-horse, his hunting-hound, are dearer to him than the despised Jewess. My mind, gentle maiden," continued Ivanhoe, "is more disturbed by anxiety than my body with pain. From the speeches of those men who were my warders just now, I learn that I am a prisoner, and if I judge aright of the loud, hoarse voice which even now dispatched them hence on some military duty, I am in the castle of Front-de-Bœuf. If so, how will this end, or how can I protect Rowena and my father?" "He names not the Jew or Jewess," said Rebecca internally. "Yet what is our portion in him, and how justly am I punished by heaven for letting my thoughts dwell upon him?" She hastened, after this brief self-accusation, to give Ivanhoe what information she could, but it amounted only to this, that the Templar Bois-Guilbert and the Baron Front-de-Bœuf were commanders within the castle, that it was beleaguered from without, but by whom she knew not. She added that there was a Christian priest within the castle, who might be possessed of more information. "A Christian priest!" said the knight joyfully. "Fetch him hither, Rebecca, if thou canst. Say a sick man desires his ghostly counsel. Say what thou wilt, but bring him. Something I must do or attempt, but how can I determine until I know how matters stand without?" Rebecca, in compliance with the wishes of Ivanhoe, made that attempt to bring Cedric into the wounded knight's chamber, which was defeated, as we have already seen, by the interference of Urfried, who had also been on the watch to intercept the supposed monk. Rebecca retired to communicate to Ivanhoe the result of her errand. They had not much leisure to regret the failure of this source of intelligence, or to contrive by what means it might be supplied, for the noise within the castle, occasioned by the defensive preparations, which had been considerable for some time, now increased into tenfold bustle and clamour. The heavy yet hasty step of the men-at-arms traversed the battlements, or resounded on the narrow and winding passages and stairs which led to the various partisans and points of defence. The voices of the knights were heard, animating their followers, or directing means of defence, while their commands were often drowned in the clashing of armour, or the clamorous shouts of those whom they addressed. Tremendous as these sounds were, and yet more terrible from the awful event which they presaged, there was a sublimity mixed with them, which Rebecca's high-toned mind could feel even in that moment of terror. Her eye kindled, although the blood fled from her cheeks, and there was a strong mixture of fear and of a thrilling sense of the sublime, as she repeated, half whispering to herself, half speaking to her companion, the sacred text: "The quiver rattleth, the glittering spear and the shield, the noise of the captains and the shouting." But Ivanhoe was like the war-horse of that sublime passage, glowing with impatience at his inactivity, and with his ardent desire to mingle in the affray of which these sounds were the introduction. "If I could but drag myself," he said, "to yonder window, that I might see how this brave game is like to go! If I had but bow to shoot a shaft, or battle-axe to strike, were it but a single blow for our deliverance! It is in vain, it is in vain, I am alike nerveless and weaponless." "Fret not thyself, noble knight," answered Rebecca. "The sounds have ceased of a sudden. It may be they join not battle." "Thou knowest naught of it," said Wilfred impatiently. "This dead pause only shows that the men are at their posts on the walls, and expecting an instant attack. What we have heard was but the instant muttering of the storm. It will burst anon in all its fury. Could I but reach yonder window!" "Thou wilt but injure thyself by the attempt, noble knight," replied his attendant. Observing his extreme solicitude, she firmly added, "I myself will stand at the lattice, and describe to you as I can what passes without." "You must not, you shall not," exclaimed Ivanhoe. "Each lattice, each aperture will be soon a mark for the archers, some random shaft—" "It shall be welcome," murmured Rebecca, as with firm pace she ascended 2 or 3 steps, which led to the window of which they spoke. "Rebecca, dear Rebecca," exclaimed Ivanhoe, "this is no maiden's pastime. Do not expose thyself to wounds and death, and render me for ever miserable for having given the occasion. At least cover thyself with yonder ancient buckler, and show as little of your person at the lattice as may be." Following with wonderful promptitude the directions of Ivanhoe, and availing herself of the protection of the large ancient shield which she placed against the lower part of the window, Rebecca, with tolerable security to herself, could witness part of what was passing without the castle, and report to Ivanhoe the preparations which the assailants were making for the storm. Indeed, the situation which she thus obtained was peculiarly favourable for this purpose, because, being placed on an angle of the main building, Rebecca could not only see what passed beyond the precincts of the castle, but also commanded a view of the outwork likely to be the first object of the meditated assault. It was an exterior fortification of no great height or strength, intended to protect the postern gate through which Cedric had been recently dismissed by Front de Bœuf. The castle moat divided this species of barbican from the rest of the fortress, so that, in case of its being taken, it was easy to cut off the communication with the main building by withdrawing the temporary bridge. In the outwork was a sally-port corresponding to the postern of the castle, and the whole was surrounded by a strong palisade. Rebecca could observe, from the number of men placed for the defence of this post, that the besieged entertained apprehensions for its safety, and from the mustering of the assailants in a direction nearly opposite to the outwork, it seemed no less plain that it had been selected as a vulnerable point of attack. These appearances she hastily communicated to Ivanhoe, and added, "The skirts of the wood seemed lined with archers, although only a few are advanced from its dark shadow." "Under what banner?" asked Ivanhoe. "Under no ensign of war which I can observe," answered Rebecca. "A singular novelty," muttered the knight, "to advance to storm such a castle without pennon or banner displayed. Seest thou who they be that act as leaders?" "A knight clad in sable armour is the most conspicuous," said the Jewess. "He alone is armed from head to heel, and seems to assume the direction of all around him." "What device does he bear on his shield?" replied Ivanhoe. "Something resembling a bar of iron, and a padlock painted blue on the black shield." "A fetterlock and shacklebolt azure," said Ivanhoe. "I know not who may bear the device, but well I ween it might now be mine own. Canst thou not see the motto?" "Scarce the device itself at this distance, but when the sun glances fair upon his shield, it shows as I tell you." "Seem there no other leaders?" exclaimed the anxious inquirer. "None of mark and distinction that I can behold from this station," said Rebecca, "but doubtless the other side of the castle is also assailed. They appear even now preparing to advance. God of Zion protect us! What a dreadful sight! Those who advance first bear huge shields and defences made of plank. The others follow, bending their bows as they come on. They raise their bows. God of Moses, forgive the creatures thou hast made. Her description was here suddenly interrupted by the signal for assault, which was given by the blast of a shrill bugle, and at once answered by a flourish of the Norman trumpets from the battlements, which, mingled with the deep and hollow clang of the nakers, a species of kettle-drum, retorted in notes of defiance the challenge of the enemy. The shouts of both parties augmented the fearful din, the assailants crying, "St. George for merry England!" and the Normans answering them with loud cries of "En avant de Bracy! Beauseant! Beauseant! Front de Bœuf à la recousse!" according to the war cries of their different commanders. It was not, however, by clamour that the contest was to be decided, and the desperate efforts of the assailants were met by an equally vigorous defence on the part of the besieged. The archers, trained by their woodland pastimes to the most effective use of the longbow, shot, to use the appropriate phrase of the time, so wholly together, that no point at which a defender could show the least part of his person escaped their cloth-yard shafts. By this heavy discharge, which continued as thick and sharp as hail, while, notwithstanding, every arrow had its individual aim, and flew by scores together against each embrasure and opening in the parapets, as well as at every window where a defender either occasionally had post, or might be suspected to be stationed, by this sustained discharge 2 or 3 of the garrison were slain, and several others wounded. But confident in their armour of proof, and in the cover which their situation afforded, the followers of Front de Bœuf and his allies showed an obstinacy in defence proportioned to the fury of the attack, and replied with the discharge of their large crossbows, as well as with their longbows, slings, and other missile weapons, to the close and continued shower of arrows, and, as the assailants were necessarily but indifferently protected, did considerably more damage than they received at their hand. The whizzing of shafts and of missiles on both sides was only interrupted by the shouts which arose when either side inflicted or sustained some notable loss. "And I must lie here like a bedridden monk," exclaimed Ivanhoe, "while the game that gives me freedom or death is played out by the hand of others. Look from the window once again, kind maiden, but beware that you are not marked by the archers beneath. Look out once more, and tell me if they yet advance to the storm." With patient courage, strengthened by the interval which she had employed in mental devotion, Rebecca again took post at the lattice, sheltering herself, however, so as not to be visible from beneath. "What dost thou see, Rebecca?" again demanded the wounded knight. "Nothing but the cloud of arrows flying so thick as to dazzle mine eyes, and to hide the bowmen who shoot them." "That cannot endure," said Ivanhoe. "If they press not right on to carry the castle by pure force of arms, the archery may avail but little against stone walls and bulwarks. Look for the knight of the fetterlock, fair Rebecca, and see how he bears himself, for as the leader is, so will his followers be." "I see him not," said Rebecca. "Foul craven!" exclaimed Ivanhoe. "Does he blench from the helm when the wind blows highest?" "He blenches not, said Rebecca. "I see him now. He leads a body of men close under the outer barrier of the barbican. They pull down the piles and palisades. They hew down the barriers with axes. His high black plume floats abroad over the throng like a raven over the field of the slain. They have made a breach in the barriers. They rush in. They are thrust back. Front de Bœuf heads the defenders. I see his gigantic form above the press. They throng again to the breach, and the pass is disputed hand to hand and man to man. God of Jacob! It is the meeting of 2 fierce tides, the conflict of 2 oceans moved by adverse winds." She turned her head from the lattice, as if unable longer to endure a sight so terrible. "Look forth again, Rebecca," said Ivanhoe, mistaking the cause of her retiring. "The archery must in some degree have ceased, since they are now fighting hand to hand. Look again, there is now less danger." Rebecca again looked forth, and almost immediately exclaimed, "Holy prophets of the law! Front de Bœuf and the Black Knight fight hand to hand on the breach, amid the roar of their followers, who watch the progress of the strife. Heaven strike with the cause of the oppressed and of the captive!" She then uttered a loud shriek, and exclaimed, "He is down! He is down!" "Who is down?" cried Ivanhoe. "For our dear lady's sake, tell me which has fallen." "The Black Knight," answered Rebecca faintly, then instantly again shouted with joyful eagerness, "But no! The name of the Lord of Hosts be blessed, he is on foot again, and fights as if there were 20 men's strength in his single arm. His sword is broken. He snatches an axe from a yeoman. He presses Front de Bœuf with blow on blow. The giant stoops and totters like an oak under the steel of the woodman. He falls. He falls." "Front de Bœuf!" exclaimed Ivanhoe. "Front de Bœuf!" answered the Jewess. His men rush to the rescue, headed by the haughty Templar. Their united force compels the champion to pause. They drag Front de Bœuf within the walls. "The assailants have won the barriers, have they not?" said Ivanhoe. "They have, they have!" exclaimed Rebecca. "And they press the besieged hard upon the outer wall. Some plant ladders, some swarm like bees, and endeavour to ascend upon the shoulders of each other. Down go stones, beams, and trunks of trees upon their heads, and as fast as they bear the wounded to the rear, fresh men supply their places in the assault. Great God, hast thou given men thine own image, that it should be thus cruelly defaced by the hands of their brethren?" "Think not of that," said Ivanhoe. "This is no time for such thoughts. Who yield? Who push their way?" "The ladders are thrown down," replied Rebecca, shuddering. "The soldiers lie grovelling under them like crushed reptiles. The besieged have the better." "St. George strike for us!" exclaimed the knight. "Do the false yeomen give way?" "No," exclaimed Rebecca, "they bear themselves right yeomanly. The Black Knight approaches the postern with his huge axe. The thundering blows which he deals, you may hear them above all the din and shouts of the battle. Stone and beams are hailed down on the bold champion. He regards them no more than if they were thistledown or feathers." "By St. John of Acre," said Ivanhoe, raising himself joyfully on his couch, "methought there was but one man in England that might do such a deed." "The postern gate shakes," continued Rebecca. "It crashes. It is splintered by his blows. They rush in. The outwork is won. O God, they hurl the defenders from the battlements. They throw them into the moat. O men, if ye be indeed men, spare them that can resist no longer." The bridge which communicates with the castle, have they won that pass?" exclaimed Ivanhoe. "No," replied Rebecca. "The Templar has destroyed the plank on which they crossed. Few of the defenders escaped with him into the castle. The shrieks and cries which you hear tell of the fate of the others. Alas, I see it is still more difficult to look upon victory than upon battle." "What do they now, maiden?" said Ivanhoe. "Look forth yet again. This is no time to faint at bloodshed." "It is over for the time," answered Rebecca. "Our friends strengthen themselves within the outwork which they have mastered, and it affords them so good a shelter from the foeman's shot that the garrison only bestow a few bolts on it from interval to interval, as if rather to disquiet than effectively to injure them." "Our friends," said Wilfred, "will surely not abandon an enterprise so gloriously begun and so happily attained. Oh no, I will put my faith in the good knight whose axe hath rent heart of oak and bars of iron. Singular," he again muttered to himself, "if there be two who can do a deed of such daring do. A fetterlock and a shacklebolt on a field sable. What may that mean? Seest thou naught else, Rebecca, by which the Black Knight may be distinguished?" "Nothing," said the Jewess. "All about him is black as the wing of the night raven. Nothing can I spy that can mark him further. But, having once seen him put forth his strength in battle, methinks I could know him again among 1,000 warriors. He rushes to the fray as if he were summoned to a banquet. There is more than mere strength. There seems as if the whole soul and spirit of the champion were given to every blow which he deals upon his enemies. God assoil ye him of the sin of bloodshed. It is fearful, yet magnificent, to behold how the arm and heart of one man can triumph over hundreds." "Rebecca," said Ivanhoe, "thou hast painted a hero. Surely they rest but to refresh their force, or to provide the means of crossing the moat. Under such a leader as thou hast spoken this night to be, there are no craven fears, no cold-blooded delays, no yielding up a gallant emprise, since the difficulties which render it arduous render it also glorious. I swear by the honour of my house, I vow by the name of my bright lady love, I would endure 10 years' captivity to fight one day by that good knight's side in such a quarrel as this." "Alas," said Rebecca, leaving her station at the window and approaching the couch of the wounded knight, "this impatient yearning after action, this struggling with and repining at your present weakness, will not fail to injure your returning health. How couldst thou hope to inflict wounds on others, ere that be healed which thou thyself hast received?" "Rebecca," he replied, "thou knowest not how impossible it is for one trained to actions of chivalry to remain passive as a priest or a woman when they are acting deeds of honour around him. The love of battle is the food upon which we live. The dust of the melee is the breath of our nostrils. We live not, we wish not to live, longer than while we are victorious and renowned. Such, maiden, are the laws of chivalry to which we are sworn, and to which we offer all that we hold dear." "Alas," said the fair Jewess, "and what is it, valiant knight, save an offering of sacrifice to a demon of vain glory, and a passing through the fire to Moloch? What remains to you as the prize of all the blood you have spilt, of all the travail and pain you have endured, of all the tears which your deeds have caused, when death hath broken the strong man's spear and overtaken the speed of his war-horse?" "What remains?" cried Ivanhoe. "Glory, maiden, glory, which gilds our sepulchre and embalms our name." "Glory," continued Rebecca, "alas, is the rusted mail which hangs as hatchment over the champion's dim and mouldering tomb, is the defaced sculpture of the inscription which the ignorant monk can hardly read to the inquiring pilgrim, are these sufficient rewards for the sacrifice of every kindly affection, for a life spent miserably that ye may make others miserable? Or is there such virtue in the rude rhymes of a wandering bard, that domestic love, kindly affection, peace, and happiness are so wildly bartered, to become the hero of those ballads which vagabond minstrels sing to drunken churls over their evening ale?" "By the soul of Hereward," replied the knight impatiently, "thou speakest, maiden, of thou knowest not what. Thou wouldst quench the pure light of chivalry, which alone distinguishes the noble from the base, the gentle knight from the churl and the savage, which rates our life far, far beneath the pitch of our honour, raises us victorious over pain, toil, and suffering, and teaches us to fear no evil but disgrace. Thou art no Christian, Rebecca, and to thee are unknown those high feelings which swell the bosom of a noble maiden when her lover hath done some deed of emprise which sanctions his flame. Chivalry! Why, maiden, she is the nurse of pure and high affection, the stay of the oppressed, the redresser of grievances, the curb of the power of the tyrant. Nobility were but an empty name without her, and liberty finds the best protection in her lance and her sword." "I am indeed," said Rebecca, "sprung from a race whose courage was distinguished in the defence of their own land, but who warred not, even while yet a nation, save at the command of the Deity, or in defending their country from oppression. The sound of the trumpet wakes Judah no longer, and her despised children are now but the unresisting victims of hostile and military oppression. Well hast thou spoken, Sir Knight, until the God of Jacob shall raise up for his chosen people a second Gideon or a new Maccabeus, it ill beseemeth the Jewish damsel to speak of battle or of war." The high-minded maiden concluded the argument in a tone of sorrow, which deeply expressed her sense of the degradation of her people, embittered perhaps by the idea that Ivanhoe considered her as one not entitled to interfere in a case of honour, and incapable of entertaining or expressing sentiments of honour and generosity. "How little he knows this bosom," she said, "to imagine that cowardice or meanness of soul must needs be its guests, because I have censured the fantastic chivalry of the Nazarenes. Would to heaven that the shedding of mine own blood, drop by drop, could redeem the captivity of Judah! Nay, would to God it could avail to set free my father, and this his benefactor, from the chains of the oppressor! The proud Christian should then see whether the daughter of God's chosen people dare not to die as bravely as the vainest Nazarene maiden that boasts her descent from some petty chieftain of the rude and frozen north." She then looked towards the couch of the wounded knight. "He sleeps," she said. "Nature exhausted by sufferance and the waste of spirits, his weary frame embraces the first moment of temporary relaxation to sink into slumber. Alas, is it a crime that I should look upon him, when it may be for the last time? When yet but a short space, and those fair features will be no longer animated by the bold and buoyant spirit which forsakes them not even in sleep? When the nostril shall be distended, the mouth agape, the eyes fixed and bloodshot, and when the proud and noble knight may be trodden on by the lowest caitiff of this accursed castle, yet stir not when the heel is lifted up against him. And my father, oh, my father! Evil is it with his daughter when his grey hairs are not remembered because of the golden locks of youth. What know I but that these evils are the messengers of Jehovah's wrath to the unnatural child, who thinks of a stranger's captivity before a parent's, who forgets the desolation of Judah, and looks upon the comeliness of a Gentile and a stranger? But I will tear this folly from my heart, though every fibre bleed as I rend it away." She wrapped herself closely in her veil, and sat down at a distance from the couch of the wounded knight, with her back turned towards it, fortifying, or endeavouring to fortify her mind, not only against the impending evils from without, but also against those treacherous feelings which assailed her from within. End of chapter 29. Chapter 30. Approach the chamber, look upon his bed. His is the passing of no peaceful ghost, which, as the lark arises to the sky, mid morning's sweetest breath and softest dew, is winged to heaven by good men's sighs and tears. Anselm parts otherwise. Old play. During the interval of quiet which followed the first success of the besiegers, while the one party was preparing to pursue their advantage, and the other to strengthen their means of defence, the Templar and De Bracy held brief council together in the hall of the castle. "Where is Front de Bœuf?" said the latter, who had superintended the defence of the fortress on the other side. "Men say he has been slain." "He lives," said the Templar coolly, "lives as yet. But had he worn the bull's head of which he bears the name, and 10 plates of iron to fence it withal, he must have gone down before yonder fatal axe. Yet a few hours, and Front de Bœuf is with his fathers. A powerful limb lopped off Prince John's enterprise." "And a brave addition to the kingdom of Satan," said De Bracy. "This comes of reviling saints and angels, and ordering images of holy things and holy men to be flung down on the heads of these rascal yeomen." "Go to, thou art a fool," said the Templar. "Thy superstition is upon a level with Front de Bœuf's want of faith. Neither of you can render a reason for your belief or unbelief." "Benedicite, Sir Templar," replied De Bracy. "Pray you to keep better rule with your tongue when I am the theme of it. By the Mother of Heaven, I am a better Christian man than thou and thy fellowship, for the brute goeth shrewdly about that the most holy order of the Temple of Zion nurseth not a few heretics within its bosom, and that Sir Brian de Bois Guilbert is of the number." "Care not thou for such reports," said the Templar, "but let us think of making good the castle. How fought these villain yeomen on thy side?" "Like fiends incarnate," said De Bracy. "They swarmed close up to the walls, headed, as I think, by the knave who won the prize at the archery, for I knew his horn and baldric. And this is old Fitzurse's boasted policy, encouraging these malapert knaves to rebel against us. Had I not been armed in proof, the villain had marked me down 7 times with as little remorse as if I had been a buck in season. He told every rivet on my armour with a cloth-yard shaft, that rapped against my ribs with as little compunction as if my bones had been of iron. But that I wore a shirt of Spanish mail under my plate-coat, I had been fairly sped." "But you maintained your post," said the Templar. "We lost the outwork on our part." "That is a shrewd loss," said De Bracy. "The knaves will find cover there to assault the castle more closely, and may, if not well watched, gain some unguarded corner of a tower, or some forgotten window, and so break in upon us. Our number are too few for the defence of every point, and the men complain that they can nowhere show themselves but they are the mark for as many arrows as a parish butt on a holiday even. Front de Bœuf is dying too, so we shall receive no more aid from his bull's head and brutal strength. How think you, Sir Brian, were we not better make a virtue of necessity, and compound with the rogues by delivering up our prisoners?" "How?" exclaimed the Templar. "Deliver up our prisoners, and stand an object alike of ridicule and execration, as the doughty warriors who dared by a night attack to possess themselves of the persons of a party of defenceless travellers, yet could not make good a strong castle against a vagabond troop of outlaws led by swineherds, jesters, and the very refuse of mankind? Shame on thy counsel, Maurice de Bracy! The ruins of this castle shall bury both my body and my shame ere I consent to such base and dishonourable composition." "Let us to the walls, then," said De Bracy carelessly. "That man never breathed, be he Turk or Templar, who held life at a lighter rate than I do. But I trust there is no dishonour in wishing I had here some 200 of my gallant troop of free companions. Oh, my brave lances, if ye knew but how hard your captain were this day bested, how soon should I see my banner at the head of your clump of spears, and how short while would these rabble villains stand to endure your encounter." "Wish for whom thou wilt," said the Templar, "but let us make what defence we can with the soldiers who remain. They are chiefly Front de Bœuf's followers, hated by the English for 1,000 acts of insolence and oppression." "The better," said De Bracy. "The rugged slaves will defend themselves to the last drop of their blood ere they encounter the revenge of the peasants without. Let us be up and doing then, Brian de Bois Guilbert, and, live or die, thou shalt see Maurice de Bracy bear himself this day as a gentleman of blood and lineage." "To the walls," answered the Templar, and they both ascended the battlements to do all that skill could dictate and manhood accomplish in defence of the place. They readily agreed that the point of greatest danger was that opposite to the outwork of which the assailants had possessed themselves. The castle indeed was divided from that barbican by the moat, and it was impossible that the besiegers could assail the postern door with which the outwork corresponded without surmounting that obstacle. But it was the opinion both of the Templar and De Bracy that the besiegers, if governed by the same principle their leader had already displayed, would endeavour, by a formidable assault, to draw the chief part of the defenders' observation to this point, and take measures to avail themselves of every negligence which might take place in the defence elsewhere. To guard against such an evil, their numbers only permitted the knights to place sentinels from space to space along the walls in communication with each other, who might give the alarm whenever danger was threatened. Meanwhile they agreed that De Bracy should command the defence at the postern, and the Templar should keep with him 100 of men or thereabouts as a body of reserve, ready to hasten to any other point which might be suddenly threatened. The loss of the barbican had also this unfortunate effect, that, notwithstanding the superior height of the castle walls, the besieged could not see from them with the same precision as before the operations of the enemy, for some straggling underwood approached so near the sally-port of the outwork that the assailants might introduce into it whatever force they thought proper, not only under cover, but even without the knowledge of the defenders. Utterly uncertain, therefore, upon what point the storm was to burst, De Bracy and his companion were under the necessity of providing against every possible contingency, and their followers, however brave, experienced the anxious dejection of mind incident to men enclosed by enemies who possessed the power of choosing their time and mode of attack. Meanwhile the lord of the beleaguered and endangered castle lay upon a bed of bodily pain and mental agony. He had not the usual resource of bigots in that superstitious period, most of whom were wont to atone for the crimes that they were guilty of by liberality to the Church, stupefying by this means their terrors by the idea of atonement and forgiveness, and, although the refuge which success thus purchased was no more like to the peace of mind which follows on sincere repentance than the turbid stupefaction procured by opium resembles healthy and natural slumbers, it was still a state of mind preferable to the agonies of awakened remorse. But among the vices of Front de Bœuf, a hard and griping man, avarice was predominant, and he preferred setting church and churchmen at defiance to purchasing from them pardon and absolution at the price of treasure and of manners. Nor did the Templar, an infidel of another stamp, justly characterize his associate when he said Front de Bœuf could assign no cause for his unbelief and contempt for the established faith, for the Baron would have alleged that the Church sold her wares too dear, that the spiritual freedom which she put up to sale was only to be bought, like that of the chief captain of Jerusalem, with a great sum, and Front de Bœuf preferred denying the virtue of the medicine to paying the expense of the physician. But the moment had now arrived when earth and all his treasures were gliding from before his eyes, and when the savage Baron's heart, though hard as a nether millstone, became appalled as he gazed forward into the waste darkness of futurity. The fever of his body aided the impatience and agony of his mind, and his death-bed exhibited a mixture of the newly awakened feelings of horror combating with the fixed and inveterate obstinacy of his disposition, a fearful state of mind only to be equalled in those tremendous regions where there are complaints without hope, remorse without repentance, a dreadful sense of present agony, and a presentiment that it cannot cease or be diminished. "Where be these dog-priests now?" growled the Baron, "who set such price on their ghostly mummery? Where be all those unshod Carmelites for whom old Front de Bœuf founded the convent of St. Anne, robbing his heir of many a fair rood of meadow, and many a fat field and close? Where be the greedy hounds now? Swilling, I warrant me, at the ale, or playing their juggling tricks at the bedside of some miserly churl. Me, the heir of their founder, me, whom their foundation binds them to pray for, me, ungrateful villains as they are, they suffer to die like the houseless dog on yonder common, unshriven and unhouseled. Tell the Templar to come hither. He is a priest and may do something. But no, as well confess myself to the devil as to Brian de Bois Guilbert, who recks neither of heaven nor of hell. I have heard old men talk of prayer by their own voice. Such need not to court or to bribe the false priest. But I dare not." "Lives Reginald Front de Bœuf," said a broken and shrill voice close by his bedside, "to say that there is that which he dares not." The evil conscience and the shaken nerves of Front de Bœuf heard, in this strange interruption to his soliloquy, the voice of one of those demons who, as the superstition of the times believed, beset the beds of dying men to distract their thoughts, and turn them from the meditations which concerned their eternal welfare. He shuddered and drew himself together. But instantly summoning up his wonted resolution, he exclaimed, "Who is there? What art thou that darest to echo my words in a tone like that of the night raven? Come before my couch that I may see thee." "I am thine evil angel, Reginald Front de Bœuf," replied the voice. "Let me behold thee then in thy bodily shape, if thou be'st indeed a fiend," replied the dying knight. "Think not that I will blench from thee. By the eternal dungeon, could I but grapple with these horrors that hover round me, as I have done with mortal dangers, heaven or hell should never say that I shrunk from the conflict. Think on thy sins, Reginald Front de Bœuf," said the almost unearthly voice, "on rebellion, on rapine, on murder. Who stirred up the licentious John to war against his grey-headed father, against his generous brother?" "Be thou fiend, priest, or devil," replied Front de Bœuf, "thou liest in thy throat. Not I stirred John to rebellion. Not I alone. There were 50 knights and barons, the flower of the Midland counties. Better men never laid lance in rest. And must I answer for the fault done by 50? False fiend, I defy thee. Depart and haunt my couch no more. Let me die in peace, if thou be mortal. If thou be a demon, thy time is not yet come." "In peace thou shalt not die," repeated the voice. "Even in death shalt thou think on thy murders, on the groans which this castle has echoed, on the blood that is ingrained in its floors." "Thou canst not shake me by thy petty malice," answered Front de Bœuf, with a ghastly and constrained laugh. "The infidel Jew, it was merit with heaven to deal with him as I did. Else wherefore are men canonized who dip their hands in the blood of Saracens? The Saxon porkers whom I have slain, they were the foes of my country, and of my lineage, and of my liege lord. Ho, ho, thou seest there is no crevice in my coat of plate. Art thou fled? Art thou silenced?" "No, foul parricide," replied the voice. "Think of thy father. Think of his death. Think of his banquet-room flooded with his gore, and that poured forth by the hand of a son." "Ha!" answered the Baron, after a long pause. "An thou knowest that, thou art indeed the author of evil, and as omniscient as the monks call thee. That secret I deemed locked in my own breast, and in that of one, besides, the temptress, the partaker of my guilt. Go, leave me, fiend, and seek the Saxon witch Ulrica, who alone could tell thee what she and I alone witnessed. Go, I say, to her who washed the wounds, and straightened the corpse, and gave to the slain man the outward show of one parted in time and in the course of nature. Go to her. She was my temptress, the foul provoker, the more foul rewarder of the deed. Let her, as well as I, taste of the tortures which anticipate hell." "She already tastes them," said Ulrica, stepping before the couch of Front de Bœuf. "She hath long drunken of this cup, and its bitterness is now sweetened to see that thou dost partake it. Grind not thy teeth, Front de Bœuf, roll not thine eyes, clench not thine hand, nor shake it at me with that gesture of menace. The hand which, like that of thy renowned ancestor who gained thy name, could have broken with one stroke the skull of a mountain bull, is now unnerved and powerless as mine own." "Vile, murderous hag!" replied Front de Bœuf. "Detestable screech-owl! It is then thou who art come to exult over the ruins thou hast assisted to lay low." "Ay, Reginald Front de Bœuf," answered she, "it is Ulrica. It is the daughter of the murdered Torquil Wolfganger. It is the sister of his slaughtered sons. It is she who demands of thee and of thy father's house, father and kindred, name and fame, all that she has lost by the name of Front de Bœuf. Think of my wrongs, Front de Bœuf, and answer me if I speak not truth. Thou hast been my evil angel, and I will be thine. I will dog thee till the very instant of dissolution." "Detestable fury!" exclaimed Front de Bœuf. "That moment shalt thou never witness. Ho, Giles, Clement, and Eustace! St. Maur and Stephen, seize this damned witch and hurl her from the battlements headlong. She has betrayed us to the Saxon. Ho, St. Maur, Clement! False-hearted knaves, where tarry ye?" "Call on them again, valiant baron," said the hag, with a smile of grisly mockery. "Summon thy vassals around thee. Doom them that loiter to the scourge and the dungeon. But know, mighty chief," she continued, suddenly changing her tone, "thou shalt have neither answer, nor aid, nor obedience at their hands. Listen to these horrid sounds," for the din of the recommenced assault and defence now rung fearfully loud from the battlements of the castle. "In that war-cry is the downfall of thy house. The blood-cemented fabric of Front de Bœuf's power totters to the foundation, and before the foes he most despised. The Saxon, Reginald! The scorned Saxon assails thy walls. Why liest thou here like a worn-out hind, when the Saxon storms thy place of strength?" "Gods and fiends!" exclaimed the wounded knight. "Oh, for one moment's strength to drag myself to the melee and perish as becomes my name!" "Think not of it, valiant warrior," replied she. "Thou shalt die no soldier's death, but perish like the fox in his den when the peasants have set fire to the cover around it." "Hateful hag, thou liest!" exclaimed Front de Bœuf. "My followers bear them bravely. My walls are strong and high. My comrades in arms fear not a whole host of Saxons were they headed by Hengist and Horsa. The war-cry of the Templar and of the Free Companions rises high over the conflict, and, by mine honour, when we kindle the blazing beacon for joy of our defence, it shall consume thee, body and bones, and I shall live to hear thou art gone from earthly fires to those of hell, which never sent forth an incarnate fiend more utterly diabolical." "Hold thy belief," replied Ulrica, "till the proof reach thee." "But no," she said, interrupting herself. "Thou shalt know even now the doom which all thy power, strength, and courage is unable to avoid, though it is prepared for thee by this feeble band. Markest thou the smouldering and suffocating vapour which already eddies in sable folds through the chamber? Didst thou think it was but the darkening of thy bursting eyes, the difficulty of thy cumbered breathing? No, Front de Bœuf, there is another cause. Rememberest thou the magazine of fuel that is stored beneath these apartments?" "Woman!" he exclaimed with fury, "thou hast not set fire to it? By heaven, thou hast, and the castle is in flames." "They are fast rising, at least," said Ulrica with frightful composure, "and a signal shall soon wave to warn the besiegers to press hard upon those who would extinguish them. Farewell, Front de Bœuf. May Mr. Skogula and Zernebock, gods of the ancient Saxons, fiends, as the priests now call them, supply the place of comforters at your dying bed, which Ulrica now relinquishes. But know, if it will give thee comfort to know it, that Ulrica is bound to the same dark coast with thyself, the companion of thy punishment, as the companion of thy guilt. And now, parricide, farewell for ever. May each stone of this vaulted roof find a tongue to echo that title into thine ear." So saying, she left the apartment, and Front de Bœuf could hear the crash of the ponderous key as she locked and double-locked the door behind her, thus cutting off the most slender chance of escape. In the extremity of agony, he shouted upon his servants and allies, "Stephen and St. Maur! Clement and Giles! I burn here unaided! To the rescue! To the rescue, brave Bois Guilbert! Valiant De Bracy! It is Front de Bœuf who calls. It is your master, ye traitor squires, your ally, your brother in arms, ye perjured and faithless knights. All the curses due to traitors upon your recreant heads, do you abandon me to perish thus miserably? They hear me not. They cannot hear me. My voice is lost in the din of battle. The smoke rolls thicker and thicker. The fire has caught upon the floor below. Oh, for one draught of the air of heaven, were it to be purchased by instant annihilation!" And in the mad frenzy of despair, the wretch now shouted with the shouts of the fighters, now muttered curses on himself, on mankind, and on heaven itself. "The red fire flashes through the thick smoke," he exclaimed. "The demon marches against me under the banner of his own element. Foul spirit, avoid! I go not with thee without my comrades. All are thine that garrison these walls. Thinkest thou Front de Bœuf will be singled out to go alone? No. The infidel Templar, the licentious De Bracy, Ulrica the foul murdering strumpet, the men who aided my enterprises, the dogs, Saxons, and accursed Jews who are my prisoners, all shall attend me, a goodly fellowship as ever took the downward road. Ha, 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 ha!" And he laughed in his frenzy till the vaulted roof rang again. "Who laughed there?" exclaimed Front de Bœuf, in altered mood, for the noise of the conflict did not prevent the echoes of his own mad laughter from returning upon his ear. "Who laughed there? Ulrica, was it thou? Speak, witch, and I forgive thee, for only thou or the fiend of hell himself could have laughed at such a moment. Avaunt! Avaunt!" But it were impious to trace any farther the picture of the blasphemer and parricide's deathbed. End of chapter 30.
Chapter 31. Once more into the breach, dear friends, once more, or close up the wall with our English dead. And you, good yeomen, whose limbs were made in England, show us here the mettle of your pasture. Let us swear that you are worth your breeding. Taken from King Henry V. Cedric, although not greatly confident in Ulrica's message, omitted not to communicate her promise to the Black Knight and Locksley. They were well pleased to find they had a friend within the place, who might, in the moment of need, be able to facilitate their entrance, and readily agreed with the Saxon that a storm, under whatever disadvantages, ought to be attempted, as the only means of liberating the prisoners now in the hands of the cruel Front de Bœuf. "The royal blood of Alfred is endangered," said Cedric. "The honour of a noble lady is in peril," said the Black Knight. "And, by the Saint Christopher at my baldric," said the good yeoman, "were there no other cause than the safety of that poor faithful knave, Wamba, I would jeopard a joint ere a hair of his head were hurt." "And so would I," said the friar. "What, sirs? I trust well that a fool, do ye see me, sirs, a fool that is free of his guild and master of his craft, and can give as much relish and flavour to a cup of wine as ever a flitch of bacon can. I say, brethren, such a fool shall never want a wise clerk to pray for, or to fight for him at a strait, while I can say a mass or flourish a partisan. and with that he made his heavy halberd to play around his head as a shepherd boy flourishes his light crook. "True, holy clerk," said the Black Knight, "true as if St. Dunstan himself had said it. And now, good Locksley, were it not well that noble Cedric should assume the direction of this assault?" "Not a jot I," returned Cedric. "I have never been wont to study either how to take or how to hold out those abodes of tyrannic power which the Normans have erected in this groaning land. I will fight among the foremost, but my honest neighbours well know I am not a trained soldier in the discipline of wars, or the attack of strongholds." "Since it stands thus with noble Cedric," said Locksley, "I am most willing to take on me the direction of the archery, and ye shall hang me up on my own trysting tree, and the defenders be permitted to show themselves over the walls without being stuck with as many shafts as there are cloves in a gammon of bacon at Christmas." "Well said, stout yeoman," answered the Black Knight. "And if I be thought worthy to have a charge in these matters, and can find among these brave men as many as are willing to follow a true English knight, for so I may surely call myself, I am ready, with such skill as my experience has taught me, to lead them to the attack of these walls." The parts being thus distributed to the leaders, they commenced the first assault, of which the reader has already heard the issue. When the barbican was carried, the Sable Knight sent notice of the happy event to Locksley, requesting him at the same time to keep such a strict observation on the castle as might prevent the defenders from combining their force for a sudden sally, and recovering the outwork which they had lost. This the knight was chiefly desirous of avoiding, conscious that the men whom he led, being hasty and untrained volunteers, imperfectly armed and unaccustomed to discipline, must, upon any sudden attack, fight at great disadvantage with the veteran soldiers of the Norman knights, who were well provided with arms both defensive and offensive, and who, to match the zeal and high spirit of the besiegers, had all the confidence which arises from perfect discipline and the habitual use of weapons. The knight employed the interval in causing to be constructed a sort of floating bridge, or long raft, by means of which he hoped to cross the moat in despite of the resistance of the enemy. This was a work of some time, which the leaders the less regretted, as it gave Ulrica leisure to execute her plan of diversion in their favour, whatever that might be. When the raft was completed, the Black Knight addressed the besiegers. "It avails not waiting here longer, my friends. The sun is descending in the west, and I have that upon my hands which will not permit me to tarry with you another day. Besides, it will be a marvel if the horsemen come not upon us from York, unless we speedily accomplish our purpose. Wherefore, one of ye go to Locksley, and bid him commence a discharge of arrows on the opposite side of the castle, and move forward as if about to assault it. And you, true English hearts, stand by me, and be ready to thrust the raft endlong over the moat whenever the postern on our side is thrown open. Follow me boldly across, and aid me to burst yon sallyport in the main wall of the castle. As many of you as like not the service, or are but ill armed to meet it, do you man the top of the outwork, draw your bowstrings to your ears, and mind you quell with your shot whatever shall appear to man the rampart. Noble Cedric, wilt thou take the direction of those which remain?" "No, not so, by the soul of Hereward," said the Saxon. "Lead I cannot, but may posterity curse me in my grave if I follow not with the foremost wherever thou shalt point the way. The quarrel is mine, and well it becomes me to be in the van of the battle." "Yet bethink thee, noble Saxon," said the knight, "thou hast neither hauberk, nor corslet, nor aught but that light helmet, target, and sword." "The better," answered Cedric. "I shall be the lighter to climb these walls, and, forgive the boast, Sir Knight, thou shalt this day see the naked breast of a Saxon as boldly presented to the battle as ever ye beheld the steel corslet of a Norman. In the name of God, then, said the knight, fling open the door, and launch the floating bridge. The portal, which led from the inner wall of the barbican to the moat, and which corresponded with a sally port in the main wall of the castle, was now suddenly opened. The temporary bridge was then thrust forward, and soon flashed in the waters, extending its length between the castle and the outwork, and forming a slippery and precarious passage for 2 men abreast to cross the moat. Well aware of the importance of taking the foe by surprise, the Black Knight, closely followed by Cedric, threw himself upon the bridge, and reached the opposite side. Here he began to thunder with his axe upon the gate of the castle, protected in part from the shot and stones cast by the defenders, by the ruins of the former drawbridge, which the Templar had demolished in his retreat from the barbican, leaving the counterpoise still attached to the upper part of the portal. The followers of the knight had no such shelter. 2 were instantly shot with crossbow bolts, and 2 more fell into the moat. The others retreated back into the barbican. The situation of Cedric and of the Black Knight was now truly dangerous, and would have been still more so, but for the constancy of the archers in the barbican, who ceased not to shower their arrows upon the battlements, distracting the attention of those by whom they were manned, and thus affording a respite to their 2 chiefs from the storm of missiles which must otherwise have overwhelmed them. But their situation was eminently perilous, and was becoming more so with every moment. "Shame on you all!" cried de Bracy to the soldiers around him. "Do ye call yourselves crossbowmen, and let these 2 dogs keep their station under the walls of the castle? Heave over the coping stones from the battlements, and better may not be. Get pickaxe and levers, and down with that huge pinnacle," pointing to a heavy piece of stone carved work that projected from the parapet. At this moment the besiegers caught sight of the red flag upon the angle of the tower which Ulrica had described to Cedric. The stout yeoman Locksley was the first who was aware of it, as he was hasting to the outwork, impatient to see the progress of the assault. "St. George!" he cried. "Merry St. George for England! To the charge, bold yeoman! Why leave ye the good knight and noble Cedric to storm the pass alone? Make in, mad priest! Show thou canst fight for thy rosary! Make in, brave yeoman! The castle is ours! We have friends within! See yonder flag, it is the appointed signal! Torquil's stone is ours! Think of honour! Think of spoil! One effort, and the place is ours!" With that he bent his good bow, and sent a shaft right through the breast of one of the men-at-arms, who, under de Bracy's direction, was loosening a fragment from one of the battlements to precipitate on the heads of Cedric and the Black Knight. A second soldier caught from the hands of the dying man the iron crow, with which he heaved at and had loosened the stone pinnacle, when, receiving an arrow through his headpiece, he dropped from the battlements into the moat a dead man. The men-at-arms were daunted, for no armour seemed proof against the shot of this tremendous archer. "Do ye give ground, base knaves?" said de Bracy. "Mountjoy St. Denis, give me the lever!" And snatching it up, he again assailed the loosened pinnacle, which was of weight enough, if thrown down, not only to have destroyed the remnant of the drawbridge, which sheltered the 2 foremost assailants, but also to have sunk the rude float of planks over which they had crossed. All saw the danger, and the boldest, even the stout friar himself, avoided setting foot on the raft. Thrice did Locksley bend his shaft against de Bracy, and thrice did his arrow bound back from the knight's armour of proof. "Curse on thy Spanish steel coat!" said Locksley. "Had English smith forged it, these arrows had gone through, and as if it had been silk or sendal." He then began to call out, "Comrades, friends, noble Cedric, bear back, and let the ruin fall!" His warning voice was unheard, for the din which the knight himself occasioned by his strokes upon the postern would have drowned 20 war trumpets. The faithful Gurth indeed sprung forward on the planked bridge, to warn Cedric of his impending fate, or to share it with him. But his warning would have come too late, the massive pinnacle already tottered, and de Bracy, who still heaved at his task, would have accomplished it, had not the voice of the Templar sounded close in his ears. "All is lost, de Bracy, the castle burns." "Thou art mad to say so," replied the knight. "It is all in a light flame on the western side. I have striven in vain to extinguish it." With the stern coolness which formed the basis of his character, Brian de Bois Guilbert communicated this hideous intelligence, which was not so calmly received by his astonished comrade. "Saints of paradise!" said de Bracy, "what is to be done? I vow to Saint Nicholas of Limoges a candlestick of pure gold." "Spare thy vow," said the Templar, "and mark me. Lead thy men down, as if to a sally. Throw the postern gate open. There are but 2 men who occupy the float. Fling them into the moat and push across for the barbican. I will charge from the main gate and attack the barbican on the outside, and if we can regain that post, be assured we shall defend ourselves until we are relieved, or at least till they grant us fair quarter." "It is well thought upon," said de Bracy. "I will play my part. Templar, wilt thou not fail me?" "Hand in glove I will not," said Bois Guilbert. "But haste thee, in the name of God." De Bracy hastily drew his men together, and rushed down to the postern gate, which he caused instantly to be thrown open. But scarce was this done ere the portentous strength of the Black Knight forced his way inward in despite of de Bracy and his followers. 2 of the foremost instantly fell, and the rest gave way notwithstanding all their leaders' efforts to stop them. "Dogs!" said de Bracy, "will you let 2 men win our only pass for safety?" "He is the devil!" said a veteran man-at-arms, bearing back from the blows of their sable antagonist. "And if he be the devil," replied de Bracy, "would you fly from him into the mouth of hell? The castle burns behind us, villains. Let despair give you courage, or let me forward. I will cope with this champion myself." And well and chivalrous did de Bracy that day maintain the fame he had acquired in the civil wars of that dreadful period. The vaulted passage to which the postern gave entrance, and in which these 2 redoubted champions were now fighting hand to hand, rung with the furious blows which they dealt each other, de Bracy with his sword, the Black Knight with his ponderous axe. At length the Norman received a blow, which, though its force was partly parried by his shield, for otherwise nevermore would de Bracy have again moved limb, descended yet with such violence on his crest, that he measured his length on the paved floor. "Yield thee, de Bracy," said the black champion, stooping over him, and holding against the bars of his helmet the fatal poniard with which the knights dispatched their enemies, and which was called the dagger of mercy. "Yield thee, Maurice de Bracy, rescue or no rescue, or thou art but a dead man." "I will not yield," replied de Bracy faintly, "to an unknown conqueror. Tell me thy name, or work thy pleasure on me. It shall never be said that Maurice de Bracy was prisoner to a nameless churl." The Black Knight whispered something into the ear of the vanquished. "I yield me to be true prisoner, rescue or no rescue," answered the Norman, exchanging his tone of stern and determined obstinacy for one of deep though sullen submission. "Go to the barbican," said the victor in a tone of authority, "and there await my further orders." "Yet first let me say," said de Bracy, "what it imports thee to know. Wilfred of Ivanhoe is wounded and a prisoner, and will perish in the burning castle without present help." "Wilfred of Ivanhoe!" exclaimed the Black Knight. "Prisoner, and perish! The life of every man in the castle shall answer if a hair of his head be singed. Show me his chamber." "Ascend yonder winding stair," said de Bracy. "It leads to his apartment. Wilt thou not accept my guidance? he added in a submissive voice. "No, to the barbican, and there await my orders. I trust thee not, de Bracy." During this combat and the brief conversation which ensued, Cedric, at the head of a body of men, among whom the friar was conspicuous, had pushed across the bridge as soon as they saw the postern open, and drove back the dispirited and despairing followers of de Bracy, of whom some asked quarter, some offered vain resistance, and the greater part fled towards the courtyard. De Bracy himself arose from the ground, and cast a sorrowful glance after his conqueror. "He trusts me not," he repeated, "but have I deserved his trust?" He then lifted his sword from the floor, took off his helmet in token of submission, and, going to the barbican, gave up his sword to Locksley, whom he met by the way. As the fire augmented, symptoms of it became soon apparent in the chamber, where Ivanhoe was watched and tended by the Jewess Rebecca. He had been awakened from his brief slumber by the noise of the battle, and his attendant, who had, at his anxious desire, again placed herself at the window to watch and report to him the fate of the attack, was for some time prevented from observing either by the increase of the smouldering and stifling vapour. At length the volumes of smoke which rolled into the apartment, the cries for water which were heard even above the din of the battle, made them sensible of the progress of this new danger. "The castle burns," said Rebecca. "It burns. What can we do to save ourselves?" "Fly, Rebecca, and save thine own life," said Ivanhoe, "for no human aid can avail me." "I will not fly," answered Rebecca. "We will be saved or perish together. And yet, great God! my father, what will be his fate?" At this moment the door of the apartment flew open, and the Templar presented himself, a ghastly figure, for his gilded armour was broken and bloody, and the plume was partly shorn away, partly burnt from his casque. "I have found thee," said he to Rebecca. "Thou shalt prove I will keep my word to share weal and woe with thee. There is but one path to safety. I have cut my way through 50 dangers to point it to thee. Up, and instantly follow me." "Alone," answered Rebecca, "I will not follow thee. If thou wert born of woman, if thou hast but a touch of human charity in thee, if thy heart be not hard as thy breastplate, save my aged father, save this wounded knight." "A knight," answered the Templar, with his characteristic calmness, "a knight, Rebecca, must encounter his fate, whether it meet him in the shape of sword or flame, and who recks how or where a Jew meets with his?" "Savage warrior," said Rebecca, "rather will I perish in the flames than accept safety from thee." "Thou shalt not choose, Rebecca. Once didst thou foil me, but never mortal did so twice." So saying, he seized on the terrified maiden, who filled the air with her shrieks, and bore her out of the room in his arms in spite of her cries, and without regarding the menaces and defiances which Ivanhoe thundered against him. "Hound of the Temple, stain to thine order, set free the damsel. Traitor of Bois Guilbert, it is Ivanhoe commands thee. Villain, I will have thy heart's blood." "I had not found thee, Wilfred," said the Black Knight, who at that instant entered the apartment, "but for thy shouts." "If thou be true knight," said Wilfred, "think not of me. Pursue yon ravisher. Save the Lady Rowena. Look to the noble Cedric." "In their turn," answered he of the fetterlock, "but thine is first." And seizing upon Ivanhoe, he bore him off with as much ease as the Templar had carried off Rebecca, rushed with him to the postern, and having there delivered his burden to the care of 2 yeomen, he again entered the castle to assist in the rescue of the other prisoners. One turret was now in bright flames, which flashed out furiously from window and shot-hole, but in other parts the great thickness of the walls and the vaulted roofs of the apartments resisted the progress of the flames, and there the rage of man still triumphed, as the scarce more dreadful element held mastery elsewhere, for the besiegers pursued the defenders of the castle from chamber to chamber, and satiated in their blood the vengeance which had long animated them against the soldiers of the tyrant Front de Bœuf. Most of the garrison resisted to the uttermost. Few of them asked quarter. None received it. The air was filled with groans and clashing of arms. The floors were slippery with the blood of despairing and expiring wretches. Through this scene of confusion, Cedric rushed in quest of Rowena, while the faithful Gurth, following him closely through the melee, neglected his own safety while he strove to avert the blows that were aimed at his master. The noble Saxon was so fortunate as to reach his ward's apartment just as she had abandoned all hope of safety, and, with a crucifix clasped in agony to her bosom, sat in expectation of instant death. He committed her to the charge of Gurth, to be conducted in safety to the Barbican, the road to which was now cleared of the enemy, and not yet interrupted by the flames. This accomplished, the loyal Cedric hastened in quest of his friend Athelstane, determined, at every risk to himself, to save that last scion of Saxon royalty. But ere Cedric penetrated as far as the old hall in which he had himself been a prisoner, the inventive genius of Wamba had procured liberation for himself and his companion in adversity. When the noise of the conflict announced that it was at the hottest, the jester began to shout, with the utmost power of his lungs, "St. George and the Dragon! Bonny St. George for merry England! The castle is won!" And these sounds he rendered yet more fearful, by banging against each other 2 or 3 pieces of rusty armour which lay scattered around the hall. A guard, which had been stationed in the outer or anteroom, and whose spirits were already in a state of alarm, took fright at Wamba's clamour, and, leaving the door open behind them, ran to tell the Templar that foemen had entered the old hall. Meantime the prisoners found no difficulty in making their escape into the anteroom, and from thence into the court of the castle, which was now the last scene of contest. Here sat the fierce Templar, mounted on horseback, surrounded by several of the garrison both on horse and foot, who had united their strength to that of this renowned leader, in order to secure the last chance of safety and retreat which remained to them. The drawbridge had been lowered by his orders, but the passage was beset, for the archers, who had hitherto only annoyed the castle on that side by their missiles, no sooner saw the flames breaking out and the bridge lowered, than they thronged to the entrance, as well to prevent the escape of the garrison, as to secure their own share of booty ere the castle should be burnt down. On the other hand, a party of the besiegers who had entered by the postern was now issuing out into the courtyard, and attacking with fury the remnant of the defenders who were thus assaulted on both sides at once. Animated, however, by despair, and supported by the example of their indomitable leader, the remaining soldiers of the castle fought with the utmost valour, and, being well armed, succeeded more than once in driving back the assailants, though much inferior in numbers. Rebecca, placed on horseback before one of the Templar's Saracen slaves, was in the midst of the little party, and Bois Guilbert, notwithstanding the confusion of the bloody fray, showed every attention to her safety. Repeatedly he was by her side, and, neglecting his own defence, held before her the fence of his triangular steel-plated shield, and anon starting from his position by her, he cried his war-cry, dashed forward, struck to earth the most forward of the assailants, and was on the same instant once more at her bridle rein. Athelstane, who, as the reader knows, was slothful, but not cowardly, beheld the female form which the Templar protected thus sedulously, and doubted not that it was Rowena whom the knight was carrying off, in despite of all resistance which could be offered. "By the soul of St. Edward," he said, "I will rescue her from yonder over-proud knight, and he shall die by my hand."
Think what you do, cried Wamba. Hasty hand catches frog for fish. By my bauble, yonder is none of my Lady Rowena. See but her long dark locks. Nay, and ye will not know black from white. Ye may be leader, but I will be no follower. No bones of mine shall be broken unless I know for whom. And you without armour too. Bethink you, silk bonnet never kept out steel blade. Nay, then, if wilful will to water, wilful must drench. Deus vobiscum, most doughty Athelstane, he concluded, loosening the hold which he had hitherto kept upon the Saxon's tunic. To snatch a mace from the pavement, on which it lay beside one whose dying grasp had just relinquished it, to rush on the Templar's band, and to strike in quick succession to the right and left, levelling a warrior at each blow, was, for Athelstane's great strength, now animated with unusual fury, but the work of a single moment. He was soon within 2 yards of Bois Gilbert, whom he defied in his loudest tone. "Turn, false-hearted Templar! Let her go whom thou art unworthy to touch. Turn, limb of a hand of murdering and hypocritical robbers!" "Dog," said the Templar, grinding his teeth, "I will teach thee to blaspheme the holy order of the Temple of Zion." And with these words, half wheeling his steed, he made a demi-courbette towards the Saxon, and, rising in the stirrups, so as to take full advantage of the descent of the horse, he discharged a fearful blow upon the head of Athelstane. Well said Wamba, that silken bonnet keeps out no steel blade. So trenchant was the Templar's weapon, that it shore asunder, as it had been a willow twig, the tough and plated handle of the mace, which the ill-fated Saxon reared to parry the blow, and, descending on his head, levelled him with the earth. "Ha! Beau sang!" exclaimed Bois Gilbert. "Thus be it to the maligners of the Temple Knights!" Taking advantage of the dismay which was spread by the fall of Athelstane, and calling aloud, "Those who would save themselves, follow me!" he pushed across the drawbridge, dispersing the archers who would have intercepted them. He was followed by his Saracens and some 5 or 6 men-at-arms, who had mounted their horses. The Templar's retreat was rendered perilous by the numbers of arrows shot off at him and his party, but this did not prevent him from galloping round to the barbican, of which, according to his previous plan, he supposed it possible De Bracy might have been in possession. "De Bracy! De Bracy!" he shouted. "Art thou there?" "I am here," replied De Bracy, "but I am a prisoner." "Can I rescue thee?" cried Bois Gilbert. "No," replied De Bracy, "I have rendered me, rescue or no rescue. I will be true prisoner. Save thyself. There are hawks abroad. Put the seas betwixt you and England. I dare not say more." "Well," answered the Templar, "an thou wilt tarry there, remember I have redeemed word and glove. Be the hawks where they will, methinks the walls of the preceptory of Templestowe will be cover sufficient, and thither will I, like heron to her haunt." Having thus spoken, he galloped off with his followers. Those of the castle who had not gotten to horse still continued to fight desperately with the besiegers after the departure of the Templar, but rather in despair of quarter than that they entertained any hope of escape. The fire was spreading rapidly through all parts of the castle, when Ulrica, who had first kindled it, appeared on a turret, in the guise of one of the ancient Furies, yelling forth a war-song such as was of yore raised on the field of battle by the scalds of the yet heathen Saxons. Her long dishevelled grey hair flew back from her uncovered head, the inebriating delight of gratified vengeance contended in her eyes with the fire of insanity, and she brandished the distaff which she held in her hand, as if she had been one of the fatal sisters, who spin and abridge the thread of human life. Tradition has preserved some wild strophes of the barbarous hymn which she chanted wildly amid that scene of fire and of slaughter. Verse 1. Whet the bright steel, sons of the white dragon, kindle the torch, daughter of Hengist.
The steel glimmers not for the carving of the banquet. It is hard, broad, and sharply pointed. The torch goeth not to the bridal chamber. It steams and glitters blue with sulphur. Whet the steel, the raven croaks. Light the torch. Zernebok is yelling. Whet the steel, sons of the dragon. Kindle the torch, daughter of Hengist. Verse 2. The black cloud is low over the Thane's castle. The eagle screams, he rides on its bosom. Scream not, grey rider of the sable cloud, thy banquet is prepared. The maidens of Valhalla look forth, the race of Hengist will send them guests. Shake your black tresses, maidens of Valhalla, and strike your loud timbrels for joy. Many a haughty step bends to your halls, many a helmed head. Verse 3. Dark sits the evening upon the Thane's castle. The black clouds gather round. Soon shall they be red as the blood of the valiant. The destroyer of forests shall shake his red crest against them. He, the bright consumer of palaces, broad waves he his blazing banner, red, wide, and dusky, over the strife of the valiant. His joy is in the clashing swords and broken bucklers. He loves to lick the hissing blood as it bursts warm from the wound. Verse 4. All must perish. The sword cleaveth the helmet. The strong armour is pierced by the lance. Fire devoureth the dwelling of princes. Engines break down the fences of the battle. All must perish. The race of Hengist is gone. The name of Horsa is no more. Shrink not then from your doom, sons of the sword. Let your blades drink blood like wine. Feast ye in the banquet of slaughter, by the light of the blazing halls. Strong be your swords while your blood is warm, and spare neither for pity nor fear, for vengeance hath but an hour. Strong hate itself shall expire. I also must perish. The towering flames had now surmounted every obstruction, and rose to the evening skies one huge and burning beacon, seen far and wide through the adjacent country. Tower after tower crashed down, with blazing roof and rafter, and the combatants were driven from the courtyard. The vanquished, of whom very few remained, scattered and escaped into the neighbouring wood. The victors, assembling in large bands, gazed with wonder, not unmixed with fear, upon the flames in which their own ranks and arms glanced dusky red. The maniac figure of the Saxon Ulrica was for a long time visible on the lofty stand she had chosen, tossing her arms abroad with wild exultation, as if she reigned empress of the conflagration which she had raised. At length, with a terrific crash, the whole turret gave way, and she perished in the flames which had consumed her tyrant. An awful pause of horror silenced each murmur of the armed spectators, who, for the space of several minutes, stirred not a finger, save to sign the cross. The voice of Locksley was then heard. "Shout, yeomen! The den of tyrants is no more! Let each bring his spoil to our chosen place of rendezvous at the trysting tree in the Harthill walk, for there at break of day will we make just partition among our own bands, together with our worthy allies in this great deed of vengeance." End of chapter.
Chapter 32. Trust me, each state must have its policies. Kingdoms have edicts, cities have their charters. Even the wild outlaw, in his forest walk, keeps yet some touch of civil discipline. For not since Adam wore his verdant apron, hath man with man in social union dwelt, but laws were made to draw that union closer. Old Play. The daylight had dawned upon the glades of the oak forest. The green boughs glittered with all their pearls of dew. The hind led her fawn from the covert of high fern to the more open walks of the greenwood, and no huntsman was there to watch or intercept the stately hart, as he paced at the head of the antlered herd. The outlaws were all assembled around the trysting tree in the Harthill walk, where they had spent the night in refreshing themselves after the fatigues of the siege, some with wine, some with slumber, many with hearing and recounting the events of the day, and computing the heaps of plunder which their success had placed at the disposal of their chief. The spoils were indeed very large; for, notwithstanding that much was consumed, a great deal of plate, rich armour, and splendid clothing had been secured by the exertions of the dauntless outlaws, who could be appalled by no danger when such rewards were in view. Yet so strict were the laws of their society, that no one ventured to appropriate any part of the booty which was brought into one common mass, to be at the disposal of their leader. The place of rendezvous was an aged oak; not however the same to which Locksley had conducted Gurth and Wamba in the earlier part of the story, but one which was the centre of a sylvan amphitheatre, within half a mile of the demolished castle of Torquilstone. Here Locksley assumed his seat, a throne of turf erected under the twisted branches of the huge oak, and the sylvan followers were gathered around him. He assigned to the Black Knight a seat at his right hand, and to Cedric a place on his left. "Pardon my freedom, noble sirs," he said, "but in these glades I am monarch, they are my kingdom; and these my wild subjects would reck but little of my power, were I, within my own dominions, to yield place to mortal man. Now, sirs, who hath seen our chaplain? Where is our curtal friar? A mass amongst Christian men best begins a busy morning." No one had seen the Clerk of Copmanhurst. "Over God's forbode," said the outlaw chief, "I trust the jolly priest hath but abidden by the wine-pot a thought too late. Who saw him since the castle was ta'en?" "I," quoth the miller, "marked him busy about the door of a cellar, swearing by each saint in the calendar he would taste the smack of Front de Bœuf's Gascoigne wine." "Now, the saints, as many as there be of them," said the Captain, "forfend, lest he was drunk too deep of the wine-butts, and perished by the fall of the castle. Away, miller! Take with you enow of men, seek the place where you last saw him, throw water from the moat on the scorching ruins, I will have them removed stone by stone ere I lose my curtal friar." The numbers who hastened to execute this duty, considering that an interesting division of spoil was about to take place, showed how much the troop had at heart the safety of their spiritual father. "Meanwhile, let us proceed," said Locksley; "for when this bold deed shall be sounded abroad, the bands of De Bracy, of Malvoisin, and other allies of Front de Bœuf, will be in motion against us, and it were well for our safety that we retreat from the vicinity. Noble Cedric," he said, turning to the Saxon, "that spoil is divided into 2 portions. Do thou make choice of that which best suits thee, to recompense thy people who were partakers with us in this adventure." "Good yeoman," said Cedric, "my heart is oppressed with sadness. The noble Athelstane of Coningsburgh is no more, the last sprout of the sainted Confessor. Hopes have perished with him which can never return. A sparkle hath been quenched by his blood, which no human breath can again rekindle. My people, save the few who are now with me, do but tarry my presence to transport his honoured remains to their last mansion. The Lady Rowena is desirous to return to Rotherwood, and must be escorted by a sufficient force. I should, therefore, ere now, have left this place, and I waited, not to share the booty, for, so help me God and Saint Withold, as neither I nor any of mine will touch the value of a liard, I waited but to render my thanks to thee and to thy bold yeoman for the life and honour ye have saved." "Nay, but," said the chief outlaw, "we did but half the work at most. Take of the spoil what may reward your own neighbours and followers." "I am rich enough to reward them from mine own wealth," answered Cedric. "And some," said Wamba, "have been wise enough to reward themselves. They do not march off empty-handed altogether. We do not all wear motley." "They are welcome," said Locksley; "our laws bind none but ourselves." "But thou, my poor knave," said Cedric, turning about and embracing his jester, "how shall I reward thee, who feared not to give thy body to chains and death instead of mine? All forsook me when the poor fool was faithful." A tear stood in the eye of the rough Thane as he spoke, a mark of feeling which even the death of Athelstane had not extracted; but there was something in the half-instinctive attachment of his clown that waked his nature more keenly than even grief itself. "Nay," said the Jester, extricating himself from master's caress, "if you pay my service with the water of your eye, the Jester must weep for company, and then what becomes of his vocation? But, uncle, if you would indeed pleasure me, I pray you to pardon my playfellow Gurth, who stole a week from your service to bestow it on your son." "Pardon him!" exclaimed Cedric. "I will both pardon and reward him. Kneel down, Gurth." The swineherd was in an instant at his master's feet. "Theo and Esne art thou no longer," said Cedric, touching him with a wand. "Folk free and sackless art thou, in town and from town, in the forest as in the field. A hide of land I give to thee in my steads of Walbrum, from me and mine to thee and thine, aye and for ever. And God's malison on his head who this gainsays." No longer a serf, but a freeman and a landholder, Gurth sprung upon his feet, and twice bounded aloft to almost his own height from the ground. "A smith and a file!" he cried, "to do away the collar from the neck of a freeman! Noble master, doubled is my strength by your gift, and doubly will I fight for you. There is a free spirit in my breast, I am a man changed to myself and all around. Ha! Fangs!" he continued, for that faithful cur, seeing his master thus transported, began to jump upon him, to express his sympathy, "knowest thou thy master still?" "Ay," said Wamba, "Fangs and I still know thee, Gurth, though we must needs abide by the collar. It is only thou art likely to forget both us and thyself." "I shall forget myself indeed, ere I forget thee, true comrade," said Gurth; "and were freedom fit for thee, Wamba, the master would not let thee want it." "Nay," said Wamba, "never think I envy thee, brother Gurth. The serf sits by the hall fire, when the freeman must forth to the field of battle. And what saith Oldhelm of Malmsbury? Better a fool at a feast, than a wise man at a fray." The tramp of horses was now heard, and the Lady Rowena appeared, surrounded by several riders, and a much stronger party of footmen, who joyfully shook their pikes and clashed their brown bills for joy of her freedom. She herself, richly attired, and mounted on a dark chestnut palfrey, had recovered all the dignity of her manner, and only an unwonted degree of paleness showed the sufferings she had undergone. Her lovely brow, though sorrowful, bore on it a cast of reviving hope for the future, as well as of grateful thankfulness for the past deliverance. She knew that Ivanhoe was safe, and she knew that Athelstane was dead. The former assurance filled her with the most sincere delight; and if she did not absolutely rejoice at the latter, she might be pardoned for feeling the full advantage of being freed from further persecution on the only subject in which she had ever been contradicted by her guardian Cedric. As Rowena bent her steed towards Locksley's seat, that bold yeoman, with all his followers, rose to receive her, as if by a general instinct of courtesy. The blood rose to her cheeks, as, courteously waving her hand, and bending so low that her beautiful and loose tresses were for an instant mixed with the flowing mane of her palfrey, she expressed in few but apt words her obligations and her gratitude to Locksley and her other deliverers. "God bless you, brave men," she concluded. "God and Our Lady bless you and requite you for gallantly perilling yourselves in the cause of the oppressed. If any of you should hunger, remember Rowena has food. If you should thirst, she has many a butt of wine and brown ale. And if the Normans drive ye from these walks, Rowena has forests of her own, where her gallant deliverers may range at full freedom, and never ranger ask whose arrow hath struck down the deer." "Thanks, gentle lady," said Locksley, "thanks from my company and myself. But, to have saved you requites itself. We who walk the greenwood do many a wild deed, and the Lady Rowena's deliverance may be received as an atonement." Again bowing from her palfrey, Rowena turned to depart; but pausing a moment, while Cedric, who was to attend her, was also taking his leave, she found herself unexpectedly close by the prisoner De Bracy. He stood under a tree in deep meditation, his arms crossed upon his breast, and Rowena was in hopes she might pass him unobserved. He looked up, however, and, when aware of her presence, a deep flush of shame suffused his handsome countenance. He stood a moment most irresolute; then, stepping forward, took her palfrey by the rein, and bent the knee before her. "Will the Lady Rowena deign to cast an eye on a captive knight, on a dishonoured soldier?" "Sir Knight," answered Rowena, "in enterprises such as yours, the real dishonour lies not in failure, but in success." "Conquest, lady, should soften the heart," answered De Bracy. "Let me but know that the Lady Rowena forgives the violence occasioned by an ill-fated passion, and she shall soon learn that De Bracy knows how to serve her in nobler ways." "I forgive you, Sir Knight," said Rowena, "as a Christian." "That means," said Wamba, "that she does not forgive him at all." "But I can never forgive the misery and desolation your madness has occasioned," continued Rowena. "Unloose your hold on the lady's rein," said Cedric, coming up. "By the bright sun above us, but it were shame, I would pin thee to the earth with my javelin! But be well assured, thou shalt smart, Maurice de Bracy, for thy share in this foul deed." "He threatens safely who threatens a prisoner," said De Bracy; "but when had a Saxon any touch of courtesy?" Then retiring 2 steps backward, he permitted the lady to move on. Cedric, ere they departed, expressed his peculiar gratitude to the Black Champion, and earnestly entreated him to accompany him to Rotherwood. "I know," he said, "that ye errant knights desire to carry your fortunes on the point of your lance, and reck not of land or goods. But war is a changeful mistress, and a home is sometimes desirable even to the champion whose trade is wandering. Thou hast earned one in the halls of Rotherwood, noble knight. Cedric has wealth enough to repair the injuries of fortune, and all he has is his deliverer's. Come, therefore, to Rotherwood, not as a guest, but as a son or brother." "Cedric has already made me rich," said the knight. "He has taught me the value of Saxon virtue. To Rotherwood will I come, brave Saxon, and that speedily; but, as now, pressing matters of moment detain me from your halls. Peradventure, when I come hither, I will ask such a boon as will put even thy generosity to the test." "It is granted ere spoken out," said Cedric, striking his ready hand into the gauntleted palm of the Black Knight; "it is granted already, were it to affect half my fortune." "Gage not thy promise so lightly," said the Knight of the Fetterlock; "yet will I hope to gain the boon I shall ask. Meanwhile, adieu." "I have but to say," added the Saxon, "that, during the funeral rites of the noble Athelstane, I shall be an inhabitant of the halls of his castle of Coningsburgh. They will be open to all who choose to partake of the funeral banqueting; and, I speak in name of the noble Edith, mother of the fallen Prince, they will never be shut against him who laboured so bravely, though unsuccessfully, to save Athelstane from Norman chains and Norman steel." "Ay, ay," said Wamba, who had resumed his attendance on his master, "rare feeding there will be. Pity that the noble Athelstane cannot banquet at his own funeral. But he," continued the Jester, lifting up his eyes gravely, "is supping in paradise, and doubtless does honour to the cheer." "Peace, and move on," said Cedric, his anger at this untimely jest being checked by the recollection of Wamba's recent services. Rowena waved a graceful adieu to him of the Fetterlock, the Saxon bade God speed him, and on they moved through a wide glade of the forest. They had scarce departed ere a sudden procession moved from under the greenwood branches, swept slowly round the sylvan amphitheatre, and took the same direction with Rowena and her followers. The priests of a neighbouring convent, in expectation of the ample donation, or soul scat, which Cedric had propined, attended upon the car in which the body of Athelstane was laid, and sang hymns as it was sadly and slowly borne on the shoulders of his vassals to his castle of Coningsburgh, to be there deposited in the grave of Hengist, from whom the deceased derived his long descent. Many of his vassals had assembled at the news of his death, and followed the bier with all the external marks, at least, of dejection and sorrow. Again the outlaws arose, and paid the same rude and spontaneous homage to death which they had so lately rendered to beauty. The slow chant and mournful step of the priests brought back to their remembrance such of their comrades as had fallen in the yesterday's array. But such recollections dwell not long with those who lead a life of danger and enterprise, and ere the sound of the death hymn had died on the wind, the outlaws were again busied in the distribution of their spoil. "Valiant knight," said Locksley to the Black Champion, "without whose good heart and mighty arm our enterprise must altogether have failed, will it please you to take from that mass of spoil whatever may best serve to pleasure you, and to remind you of this my trysting tree?" "I accept the offer," said the Knight, "as frankly as it is given; and I ask permission to dispose of Sir Maurice de Bracy at my own pleasure." "He is thine already," said Locksley, "and well for him, else the tyrant had graced the highest bough of this oak with as many of his free companions as we could gather, hanging thick as acorns around him. But he is thy prisoner, and he is safe, though he had slain my father." "De Bracy," said the Knight, "thou art free, depart. He whose prisoner thou art, scorns to make mean revenge for what is past; but beware of the future, lest a worse thing befall thee. Maurice de Bracy, I say, beware." De Bracy bowed low and in silence, and was about to withdraw, when the yeomen burst at once into a shout of execration and derision. The proud knight instantly stopped, turned back, folded his arms, drew up his form to his full height, and exclaimed, "Peace, ye yelping curs, who open upon a cry which ye followed not when the stag was at bay. De Bracy scorns your censure as he would disdain your applause. To your brakes and caves, ye outlawed thieves! And be silent when aught knightly or noble is but spoken within a league of your fox-earths." This ill-timed defiance might have procured for De Bracy a volley of arrows, but for the hasty and imperative interference of the outlaw chief. Meanwhile, the knight caught a horse by the rein, for several which had been taken in the stables of Front de Bœufs stood accoutred around, and were a valuable part of the booty. He threw himself upon the saddle, and galloped off through the wood. When the bustle occasioned by this incident was somewhat composed, the chief outlaw took from his neck the rich horn and baldric which he had recently gained at the strife of archery near Ashby. "Noble knight," he said to him of the Fetterlock, "if you disdain not to grace by your acceptance a bugle which an English yeoman has once worn, this I will pray you to keep as a memorial of your gallant bearing, and if ye have aught to do, and, as happeneth oft to a gallant knight, ye chance to be hard bested in any forest between Trent and Tees, wind 3 mots upon the horn thus, Wassahoa! and it may well chance ye shall find helpers and rescue." He then gave breath to the bugle, and winded once and again the call which he described, until the knight had caught the notes. "Gramercy for the gift, bold yeoman," said the knight, "and better help than thine and thy rangers would I never seek, were it at my utmost need." And then in his turn he winded the call till all the greenwood rang. "Well blown and clearly," said the yeoman. "Beshrew me, and thou knowest not as much of woodcraft as of war. Thou hast been a striker of deer in thy day, I warrant. Comrades, mark these 3 mots, it is the call of the Knight of the Fetterlock, and he who hears it and hastens not to serve him at his need, I will have him scourged out of our band with his own bowstring." "Long live our leader!" shouted the yeoman, "and long live the Black Knight of the Fetterlock! May he soon use our service, to prove how readily it will be paid." Locksley now proceeded to the distribution of the spoil, which he performed with the most laudable impartiality. A 10th part of the whole was set apart for the church, and for pious uses. A portion was next allotted to a sort of public treasury, a part was assigned to the widows and children of those who had fallen, or to be expended in masses for the souls of such as had left no surviving family. The rest was divided amongst the outlaws, according to their rank and merit, and the judgment of the chief, on all such doubtful questions as occurred, was delivered with great shrewdness, and received with absolute submission. The Black Knight was not a little surprised to find that men, in a state so lawless, were nevertheless among themselves so regularly and equitably governed, and all that he observed added to his opinion of the justice and judgment of their leader. When each had taken his own proportion of the booty, and while the treasurer, accompanied by 4 tall yeomen, was transporting that belonging to the state to some place of concealment or of security, the portion devoted to the church still remained unappropriated. "I would," said the leader, "we could hear tidings of our joyous chaplain. He was never wont to be absent when meat was to be blessed, or spoil to be parted; and it is his duty to take care of these the tithes of our successful enterprise. It may be, the office has helped to cover some of his canonical irregularities. Also, I have a holy brother of his a prisoner at no great distance, and I would fain to have the friar to help me to deal with him in due sort. I greatly misdoubt the safety of the bluff priest." "I were right sorry for that," said the Knight of the Fetterlock, "for I stand indebted to him for the joyous hospitality of a merry night in his cell. Let us to the ruins of the castle; it may be we shall there learn some tidings of him." While they thus spoke, a loud shout among the yeomen announced the arrival of him for whom they feared, as they learned from the stentorian voice of the friar himself, long before they saw his burly person. "Make room, my merry men!" he exclaimed, "room for your godly father and his prisoner—cry welcome once more! I come, noble leader, like an eagle with my prey in my clutch." And making his way through the ring, amidst the laughter of all around, he appeared in majestic triumph, his huge partisan in one hand, and in the other a halter, one end of which was fastened to the neck of the unfortunate Isaac of York, who, bent down by sorrow and terror, was dragged on by the victorious priest, who shouted aloud, "Where is Allan a Dale, to chronicle me in a ballad, or if it were but a lay? By Saint Hermangild, the jingling crowder is ever out of the way where there is an apt theme for exalting valour." "Curtal Priest," said the Captain, "thou hast been at a wet mass this morning, as early as it is. In the name of Saint Nicholas, whom hast thou got here?" "A captive to my sword and to my lance, noble Captain," replied the Clerk of Copmanhurst; "to my bow and to my halberd, I should rather say. And yet I have redeemed him by my divinity from a worse captivity. Speak, Jew, have I not ransomed thee from Satanus? Have I not taught thee thy Credo, thy Pater, and thine Ave Maria? Did I not spend the whole night in drinking to thee, and in expounding of mysteries?" "For the love of God," ejaculated the poor Jew, "will no one take me out of the keeping of this this holy man?" "How's this, Jew?" said the Friar, with a menacing aspect. "Dost thou recant, Jew? Bethink thee, if thou dost relapse into thine infidelity, though thou art not so tender as a suckling pig, I would I had one to break my fast upon, thou art not so tough to be roasted. Be conformable, Isaac, and repeat the words after me. Ave Maria—" "Nay, we will have no profanation, mad priest," said Locksley. "Let us rather hear where you found this prisoner of thine." "By Saint Dunstan," said the Friar, "I found him where I sought for better where! I did step into the cellarage to see what might be rescued there, for though a cup of burnt wine, with spice, be an evening's draught for an emperor, it were waste, methought, to let so much good liquor be mulled at once; and I had caught up one runlet of sack, and was coming to call more aid among these lazy knaves, who are ever to seek when a good deed is to be done, when I was avised of a strong odour. Aha! thought I, here is the choicest juice of all in this secret crypt, and the knave butler, being disturbed in his vocation, hath left the key in the door. In therefore I went, and found just naught besides a commodity of rusted chains and this dog of a Jew, who presently rendered himself my prisoner, rescue or no rescue. I did but refresh myself after the fatigue of the action, with the unbeliever, with one humming cup of sack, and was proceeding to lead forth my captive, when, crash after crash, as with wild thunderdint and levin fire, down toppled the masonry of an outer tower, merry beshrew their hands that built it not the firmer, and blocked up the passage. The roar of one falling tower followed another. I gave up thought of life, and deeming it a dishonour to one of my profession to pass out of this world in company with a Jew, I heaved up my halberd to beat his brains out; but I took pity on his grey hairs, and judged it better to lay down the partisan, and take up my spiritual weapon for his conversion; and truly, by the blessing of Saint Dunstan, the seed has been sown in good soil; only that, with speaking to him of mysteries through the whole night, and being in a manner fasting, for the few draughts of sack which I sharpened my wits with were not worth marking, my head is well nigh dizzied, I trow. But I was clean exhausted. Gilbert and Wibbald know in what state they found me, quite and clean exhausted." "We can bear witness," said Gilbert, "for when we had cleared away the ruin, and by Saint Dunstan's help lighted upon the dungeon stair, we found the runlet of sack half empty, the Jew half dead, and the Friar more than half exhausted, as he calls it." "Ye be knaves, ye lie!" retorted the offended Friar. "It was you and your gormandizing companions that drank up the sack, and called it your morning draught. I am a pagan, and I kept it not for the captain's own throat. But what recks it? The Jew is converted, and understands all I have told him, very nearly, if not altogether, as well as myself." "Jew," said the Captain, "is this true? Hast thou renounced thine unbelief?" "May I so find mercy in your eyes," said the Jew, "as I know not one word which the reverend prelate spake to me all this fearful night. Alas! I was so distraught with agony and fear and grief, that had our holy father Abraham come to preach to me, he had found but a deaf listener." "Thou liest, Jew, and thou knowest thou dost," said the Friar. "I will remind thee of but one word of our conference. Thou didst promise to give all thy substance to our holy order." "So help me the promise, fair sirs," said Isaac, even more alarmed than before, "as no such sounds ever crossed my lips. Alas! I am an aged beggared man, I fear me a childless, have ruth on me, and let me go." "Nay," said the Friar, "if thou dost retract vows made in favour of Holy Church, thou must do penance." Accordingly he raised his halberd, and would have laid the staff of it lustily on the Jew's shoulders, had not the Black Knight stopped the blow, and thereby transferred the Holy Clerk's resentment to himself. "By Saint Thomas of Kent," said he, "an I buckle to my gear, I will teach thee, sir lazy lover, to mell with thine own matters, maugre thine own iron case there." "Nay, be not wroth with me," said the Knight; "thou knowest I am thy sworn friend and comrade." "I know no such thing," answered the Friar, "and defy thee for a meddling coxcomb." "Nay, but," said the Knight, who seemed to take a pleasure in provoking his quondam host, "hast thou forgotten how, that for my sake, for I say nothing of the temptation of the flagon and the pasty, thou didst break thy vow of fast and vigil?" "Truly, friend," said the Friar, clenching his huge fist, "I will bestow a buffet on thee." "I accept of no such presents," said the Knight; "I am content to take thy cuff, as a loan, but I will repay thee with usury as deep as ever thy prisoner there exacted in his traffic." "I will prove that presently," said the Friar. "Hola!" cried the Captain, "what art thou after, mad Friar, brawling beneath our trysting tree?" "No brawling," said the Knight; "it is but a friendly interchange of courtesy. Friar, strike an thou darest; I will stand thy blow, if thou wilt stand mine." "Thou hast the advantage with that iron pot on thy head," said the churchman; "but have at thee, down thou goest, an thou wert Goliath of Gath in his brazen helmet." The Friar bared his brawny arm up to the elbow, and putting his full strength to the blow, gave the Knight a buffet that might have felled an ox. But his adversary stood firm as a rock. A loud shout was uttered by all the yeomen around; for the Clerk's cuff was proverbial amongst them, and there were few who, in jest or earnest, had not had the occasion to know its vigour. "Now, priest," said the Knight, pulling off his gauntlet, "if I had vantage on my head, I will have none on my hand. Stand fast as a true man." "Genam meam dedi vapillatori, I have given my cheek to the smiter," said the priest; "an thou canst stir me from the spot, fellow, I will freely bestow on thee the Jew's ransom." So spoke the burly priest, assuming on his part high defiance. But who may resist his fate? The buffet of the Knight was given with such strength and good will, that the Friar rolled head over heels upon the plain, to the great amazement of all the spectators; but he arose neither angry nor crestfallen. "Brother," said he to the Knight, "thou shouldst have used thy strength with more discretion. I had mumbled but a lame mass and thou hadst broken my jaw, for the piper plays ill that wants the nether chops. Nevertheless, there is my hand, in friendly witness, that I will exchange no more cuffs with thee, having been a loser by the barter. End now all unkindness. Let us put the Jew to ransom, since the leopard will not change his spots, and a Jew he will continue to be." "The priest," said Clement, "is not half so confident of the Jew's conversion, since he received that buffet on the ear." "Go to, knave, what pratest thou of conversions? What, is there no respect? All masters and no men? I tell thee, fellow, I was somewhat toddy when I received the good Knight's blow, or I had kept my ground under it. But an thou gibest more of it, thou shalt learn I can give as well as take." "Peace all!" said the Captain. "And thou, Jew, think of thy ransom. Thou needest not to be told that thy race are held to be accursed in all Christian communities, and trust me that we cannot endure thy presence among us. Think, therefore, of an offer, while I examine a prisoner of another caste." "Were many of Front de Bœuf's men taken?" demanded the Black Knight. "None of note enough to be put to ransom," answered the Captain. "A set of hilding fellows there were, whom we dismissed to find them a new master. Enough had been done for revenge and profit. The bunch of them were not worth a cardecue. The prisoner I speak of is Better Booty, a jolly monk riding to meet his leman, and I may judge by his horse gear and wearing apparel. Here cometh the worthy prelate as pert as a peat," and, between two yeomen, was brought before the sylvan throne of the outlaw chief, our old friend, Prior Aymer of Jorvaulx. CHAPTER XXXIII.